Looking back at the history of watercolor painting, it's been primarily a sketching medium or a kind of study medium, not really an independent art form in and of itself. You can go back to the early 19th century when Turner was very interested in watercolor and the interaction of aqueous color. The British really championed watercolor through the 19th century. They used it a great deal, but mostly as a kind of documenting style of painting. It's often referred to as tinted drawings and not independent works of art. So they would do very extensive pencil drawings and then lay color over the top of it with transparent watercolor. And it was more for illustration. So, for example, you have British artists who would travel to the Orient, or they would travel around Great Britain, and they would do these tinted drawings of the locations that they saw, often very detailed architectural renderings of specific places. And that was really the tradition of watercolor through the 19th century in England. It changed a little bit in terms of the materials and techniques towards the end of the 19th century when Winsor and Newton in particular started to sell portable sets with tubes of watercolor paint as opposed to the dry cakes or what's called pan colors. It became a very portable medium. There were pads of paper, there were very small brushes, and so it made it easier for people to take the watercolors along when they were traveling. It also became a very popular thing among British ladies of the upper class. They would do little decorative paintings of flowers or lace patterns and that sort of thing. There were other significant artists who treated it in a very serious way, but it always suffered under the burden of being thought of as a secondary art form, a sketching medium, a study medium. And in many ways that continued really until the middle of the 20th century. Even there are abstract expressionists, Georgia O'Keeffe, Mark Rothko, others would use watercolor, but even then they were small scale. They were thought of as kind of studies or explorations of ideas that would be later pursued as oil paintings. They tried out various approaches to the medium. You get an artist like Charles Demuth, for example, who did a lot of things with blotting the paint and experimenting with textural effects, but still his paintings were relatively small. They were observational studies of flowers, of buildings. They were often steps towards creating oil paintings. There were also some great painters, Winslow Homer and Childe Hassam and some others at the earlier part of the century. But again, Winslow Homer started out as an illustrator. He documented the Civil War, and in drawings and watercolor paintings, they were often made to be published in newspapers and magazines. So the art form was explored, but it was always kind of secondary to oil painting. It's quite often said that the history of art is really written in the history of oil painting and not in any other medium, not in sculpture, not in graphics, not in fiber arts. Oil painting really dominated the style, and it led the prevailing ideas that motivated artists. That began to change in the late 40s, early 50s, when people like Andrew Wyeth in particular, and some other artists of that age, started to treat it independently, so that, for example, Wyeth would make watercolors for which, and they were very large scale, there were no oil paintings that resulted from them, they were never sketches, they were never studies. The image existed only as a watercolor, not in anything else. Now, he did egg tempera paintings and he did drawings, but he always thought of watercolor, and still does today, think of watercolor as its own art form. It has its own kind of style to it. He treats it in a very casual and aggressive way. He kind of jokes about the fact that he often steps on the paintings. The paper rips. it blows into the river, and he doesn't care about it. It's very immediate, it's very direct, but it's independent of his work in egg tempera, and it doesn't relate to anything else. The images are not repeated in another art form. And you find other artists of that period starting to deal with watercolor in much the same way. Particularly, for example, in California, there is an entire group of artists who are referred to as by the California School of Watercolor Painting. Artists like Millard Sheets and Phil Dyke and the whole, maybe 20 or 30 artists who only worked in watercolor. That was their only form of expression. Some of them may have done decorative art, like Millard Sheets designed murals and tiles and stuff, but his watercolors were never really preparatory works. They were always independent forms. And they liked the freedom of the medium, they liked the immediacy of it, they liked that kind of balance between abstraction and representation that one could achieve with watercolor. And it had a very strong influence on the artists of that period, and it continues to have it. In the 60s and 70s, artists decided to change the scale of the work as well as the strength of the images. And you'll find artists of the 70s and 80s who are doing monumental watercolor paintings, 20 by 40, 40 by 60 sheets of paper, very large, very complicated, very detailed paintings, were unlike any of the work that had come before in the watercolor medium. And it was their intention to change the whole attitude about watercolor, that it was no longer a preparatory medium or a kind of casual form of expression, that it was in fact a worthwhile independent form of expression. So, something similar happened with respect to drawing. There were a lot more artists who were doing drawings that didn't necessarily have to be preparatory studies for an oil painting. The attitude towards watercolor changed significantly in the 1940s and 1950s in many ways. First of all, artists started treating the medium independent of any other form of expression. So in other words, instead of just doing sketches or studies that they would take into watercolor or sculpture or printmaking, the images existed only in the watercolor form. And it wasn't just that they didn't want to take the ideas further. They felt that the medium allowed them to express themselves in a way that didn't make any sense in oil or acrylic or casein or any other medium. That what they were able to do with this very fluid, very transparent medium was different than anything they could accomplish with another art form. Secondly, the products that were available started to change. Manufacturers started introducing a wider range of pigments, particularly synthetic pigments that were very transparent and staining. Whereas, in the 19th century, there were a very limited number of colors artists could use, and some of them were fugitive. After the World War II and in the 40s and 50s, manufacturers become much more aware of the fact that certain pigments are fugitive and not light fast and therefore should be eliminated. So, for example, a color like alizarin crimson is a very fugitive color, and it will disappear from a painting if you use it and it's exposed to ultraviolet light. Well, the manufacturers started replacing those with synthetic pigments that were light fast. They expanded the range because more and more synthetic pigments were available. So, for example, the phthalocyanine colors and the quinacridone colors were introduced for the first time. And artists found that these were very exciting and opened up a lot of creative possibilities that they hadn't considered. With brushes, the manufacturers started using synthetic hair brushes along with natural hair brushes. And they were not just strands of plastic. They could pit the fibers in such a way that they would hold the pigment and release the pigment So they were less expensive, more flexible. They could be made as stiff brushes, flexible brushes. There were, so again, artists started discovering that this offered a range of creative possibilities that had not been possible before. The same was true with papers, which is the third sort of leg in the stool with watercolor painting. Traditionally, watercolor papers were mold-made in little frames that, villages in England where that would be the main enterprise, and they'd make sheets that were, say, 18 by 24, 24 by 36 maximum. Now, all of a sudden, the companies could make them in continuous rolls, so that you can buy a roll of watercolor paper and make a painting that was 40 by 60 inches or 60 by 120 inches. All those were readily available, and artists looked at it and said, there's no reason why I have to just make little paintings anymore. There's no reason why I have to just treat this medium as a sketching medium. I now have the possibility to explore many more pigments, a variety of brushes. I can make them on different surfaces of paper, different sizes of paper. So, there were half a dozen or more companies that would make a rough paper, a hot press paper, a cold press paper. They could add other materials to them, so they could mix, they could seal the surface with an acrylic medium. They could introduce casein, which is a water-based paint that's compatible. It became more, in our magazine we refer to water media, not just watercolor, because artists were looking at all of these possibilities. I mean, they are by nature creative people who challenge the norm, who look for opportunities to explore something and express something in a unique way. So the idea of breaking rules and trying new materials appealed to artists. And within the watercolor medium, there were lots of new opportunities for them to try. So all of a sudden, you started to see artists emerging in the 60s in particular who were doing these massively large paintings, where they would lay the paper out on the floor to paint, for example, because there was no easel that could hold this, or laying it out on a table and painting, instead of having this little pad in their hands and doing these delicate little sketches of flowers and whatnot. They were splashing and spraying the paint. They were projecting photographic images. They were using frisket material to block it out, so that they're using a resist technique. Introducing other water-soluble paints that were compatible with transparent watercolor. There was kind of an explosion of interest and a range and images and techniques that artists were trying. Everything from very tightly photographic images, so that you get people like Nancy Hagen and Sandra Freckleton and others who were exercising extreme control over the paint, getting very precise, carefully controlled images, to people who, like Sam Francis, who was from the West Coast, who was dripping it and splashing it and spraying it, and finding all sorts of possibilities within that range. And all of it was possible. All of it had an audience. It was partly reflected in the change in the art market. It used to be that New York was the only place to be an artist, and the galleries in New York were the only certified an artist, and the critics in New York certified an artist. Now, markets emerged in Los Angeles and Chicago and Seattle and Atlanta, and they didn't necessarily feel as though their taste had to be dictated by a small clique of people. So Sam Francis was in the Pacific Northwest. There were Bay Area figurative artists who were doing things with water media paints. A whole range of artists in California who were trying a very different approach to the medium than had been explored in the Northeast. The Californians hung on to the influence of the Impressionists, for example, much longer than the artists in the Northeast. Artists in California were very much more influenced by Asian sensibility, the way in which the Japanese and the Chinese approached painting. They were interested in the idea of the state of mind of the artist as much as they were in kind of recording observations in a careful way. So all of these things were going on. All of the artists were finding audiences for their work, collectors who were focusing on contemporary California painting or contemporary abstract painting or contemporary representational painting. Museums were mounting exhibitions and traveling shows. Catalogs were being published, books, eventually videos, now digital recordings of artists working. And so it's a much more kind of pluralistic environment in which artists can work, and especially with water media painting. Another side of this which is developed is in way there was a whole kind of social environment that developed around watercolor. The American Watercolor Society, for example, was started in the 19th century, but after the 1950s and early 60s, a lot of amateur artists started to get together and join these organizations like the National Watercolor Society, American Watercolor Society, Watercolor West, Midwest Watercolor Society. They would get together and have workshops, share ideas, teach each other how to paint. They would organize exhibitions of their work, catalogs of their work. And there became this sort of social connection between artists who were interested in watercolor. And now you can find them in almost any region of the United States. There will be, the Northwest Ohio Watercolor Society, the Southwestern Ohio Watercolor Society, the Ohio Watercolor Society, the Columbus Watercolor Society. And it's really just an excuse for people to get together and share their information, share their experience, provide opportunities for people to exhibit what they're doing outside of the gallery scene, outside of the museum world. And they're very active organizations. My company sort of tapped into that, for example. So 20 years ago, we started a magazine just about watercolor painting, and we really report on the activities of these people. And they're very much social in their orientation. They're very dedicated to what they're doing. I often say that if you ask them to identify themselves, they'll identify themselves by their medium. They'll say, "I'm a watercolorist." If you ask an oil painter the same question, they'll identify themselves by their subject. They'll say, "I'm a portrait painter, I'm a landscape painter." So there's this interesting development that occurs with watercolor that's not really matched in any other medium. This wide range of styles and approaches, activities that are completely outside of the gallery/museum world, very personal, very localized, very democratic in a way, and it's a wonderful thing to see because it's it's like the explosion of interest in sports or music. You don't necessarily have to come out of a music academy to be interested in singing, dance, or music, or drama. That there is something wonderful to be explored, whether you join a local theater group, whether you join a local art group, whether you just get a sketchbook and draw. That it isn't reserved for the professionals. I mean, they exist and they may lead the pack as a way and set a standard for others. But there's a kind of democratic development among the arts in general, and watercolor in particular, because it touches the lives of people and they feel as though there is something for them to explore. Diane Hickerson sort of fits into this contemporary scene that I've described. she says that she's always lived in Brockport, New York. She continues to live in that area. She's active in that community. That wouldn't have been possible 50 years ago. You couldn't really achieve a professional status outside of New York. I remember going to a lecture once by Robert Motherwell in which he said, in the 1940s when I started, there were essentially 50 people who would show up at museum and gallery openings, and it was essentially the same 50 people. That the art world was a relatively small community, and we all sort of knew each other. And if you wanted to be a professional artist, you had to be among those 50 people. You had to go to the openings, you had to go to the galleries, you had to live in New York. That all changed over the course of the last 50 years, and there are opportunities for artists everywhere. I mean, part of the influence was the development of state art agencies, local arts agencies. This thing called Percent for Art, for example, where cities were mandated to spend 1% of the construction budgets on art. It provided funds for local artists. It gave them opportunities to exhibit their work. State art agencies were formed that matched the National Endowment for the Arts. And it gave people an opportunity to remain in their communities, to develop a following as professional artists of stature. And Diane is one of the many artists who have benefited from that she can be thought of with a great deal of respect and admiration outside of this sort of what used to be the center of the art world. She can teach, she can exhibit her work, she enters national exhibitions, she wins awards without having to leave what has been the base and probably the inspiration for her work. I mean, I'm sure that her paintings are a reflection of the life that she has lived in this community. The internet has certainly sped up that process in the last 5 to 10 years, where now the images can be transferred instantly across the globe, that you can share your information with artists. So that, websites now have biographies, they have current work, they have step-by-step demonstrations, they have videos. There is all of this communication that's possible to share information. And really that has sort of been building over the years. About the time I started with American Artists, maybe about 30 years ago, we began to work with a company that was publishing reproductions of works of art. At that time they were offset prints. So that an artist, and I think this company started in wildlife with an artist named Roger Torrey Peterson, and then went Robert Bateman. And they would publish offset reproductions of the artist's work, in large part because the technology allowed them to get very high quality reproductions on 100% rag paper. The artist would sign them and number them as in the same way that artists used to sign and number etchings or lithographs. And a whole market developed, and a network of galleries around the country were selling the work. And it actually reinforced the sale of the original paintings. So the prices of Robert Bateman's paintings were escalating at the same time as the prices of his prints were escalating. That continued. It went to wildlife art, to Western art, to all sorts of forms of expression, and a lot of artists were doing offset reproductions. Now that technology has been sort of supplanted by computer-generated images, or what people refer to as giclée. Whenever you want to describe something in art, you either use an Italian term or a French term because it makes it sound so much more, romantic. So giclée is the French term that's been applied to basically continuous tone computer-generated images. The big advantage of them is that they are continuous tone. If you look at an offset reproduction under a loop, you'll see a dot pattern. If you look at a giclée under a loop, you do not see it. It really looks exactly like the original work of art, particularly with watercolors. You can print on a watercolor paper that's exactly the same as the one that the artist worked on. You can get absolute fidelity to the colors and the textures and the brushwork. They are amazing copies, and it allows artists to share their work with many more collectors. So, for example, if somebody like Diane might, at most create 10 paintings in a year, because of the complexity of the work, the amount of time that she puts into it, well, you can't build a career on 10 paintings a year, really. I mean, there aren't enough people who are going to see your work and acquire your work to know about you beyond, that small group of people. Plus, you have to charge so much money for those 10 paintings to justify the amount of time. So, reproductions or giclée prints allow someone like Diane and many other artists to sell very careful, very exacting reproductions of their work for far less money, because now they can sell 100 of them or 200, depending on how they set the edition size. They are still very high quality. The artist supervises them. The artist signs them. But the work is spread more widely. The artist's reputation is spread more widely. There's a greater appreciation for what he or she does. So it helps to for the artist to make a living selling more reasonably priced works of art. You don't necessarily have to go find a Bill Gates to buy your artwork. You can sell to people who just appreciate what you're doing and can afford to hang it on their walls. So again, it's a kind of democratization of the art that kind of has always been somewhat connected to printmaking in general, but now is even more easy to pursue from an artist's point of view. There are lots of places you can go to that will generate these prints for you. You don't have to go to a specialized shop that does lithographs or etchings or whatever. So it's helped artists disseminate their images, generate enough income to justify the time that's involved in the work that they're doing, still maintaining high standards and absolute control over what they're doing. Their signature certifies that they have approved it, that they have set a limit on the number of the images. Somebody isn't kind of copying the work and trying to rip the artist off and sell something that's less in quality than the original. So that and the websites and books and exhibits allow an artist to go way beyond their own small community to connect with viewers throughout the world at various levels. You can still sell the original works of art to a limited number of people for fairly significant prices, but it doesn't preclude you from sharing those images in other ways with a much wider audience of people. So you get the best of both worlds. You maintain the level of quality and the control that an artist wants, and yet you have something that you can share with people much more broadly than you were able to before, which makes more people aware of who you are and what you do. It allows you to share your ideas and your inspiration and your observations with a greater number of people. It also stimulates a greater interest in art, that art is no longer for a few people. It's not just for Bill Gates and Nelson Rockefeller or anybody else, that it's something everyone can enjoy. And now you can go into people's homes and see much more quality work that's on the walls, because it's affordable, it's accessible, it can enrich their lives. So it's created opportunities for a great many more collectors as well as artists. And because of that, again, it isn't just one form of expression. You can walk into a gallery and see work that's very challenging, very contemporary, political statements, social statements, pure abstraction, experimentation with media, people adhering all sorts of collage elements to their paintings or mixing mediums together. There is no one way in which art has to be created. There is no one critic who's dictating that art must be this or that. And it's a much it's like what happens in music. I mean, our company publishes Billboard magazine, and there are, I don't know, 50 or 60 charts. Now there's, country music and classical music and pop and rap, and they even split up, the rap into different categories. And it's because, number one, the artists are interested in exploring a much wider range of expressions. And number two, there's an audience of people who have very specific tastes that they want satisfied. They don't necessarily want to be dictated to by, record producers or artists or concert masters. If they want to go to a classical music concert, they can. If they want to download rap music onto their iPod, they can do that as well. It isn't that one doesn't preclude the other, one doesn't diminish the other, and the same happens with painting. That an artist can pursue whatever he or she wants to pursue. It can be, very, obscure and personal. It can be very specific and photographic. Any of those things is possible. There is an audience of people who will be interested in knowing what you do and sharing it with you.